Welcome back. Until now, we have been using Spring Boot to create all our examples. However, it is very important that you understand how to use Spring without Spring Boot. So that's what you would start doing in this specific section. So in this step, let's start with removing the dependency on Spring Boot Starter. So the Spring Boot Starter is the dependency which starts bringing in all the Spring Boot functionality. I don't want to use Spring Boot functionality, so I'll start with step by step getting rid of it. So the first thing I'll start with is removing this specific thing. So I'm removing that dependency org.spring framework, and now I'm actually changing the artifact ID to the base one of Spring. So the base thing for Spring is Spring Core. So Spring Core is where your bean factory is defined. The basic management of your beans is defined in Spring Core. In addition to that, we are making use of application context. So if I want to make use of an application context, then I would need to make use of something called Spring Con. So these are the two dependencies I am bringing in, and I've removed this Spring Boot starter. So let's see what would happen right now. What I'll do is I'll try and get the Spring in 5 steps basic application working, and I will leave it as an exercise for you to do to get the remaining 3 stuff working without Spring Boot. So let's get started with Spring in 5 steps basic application, and I am doing a right click, run as Java application. That's what we have been doing until now. You'd see that there would be a few exceptions which would come up. It says class not found Spring application because this is in which package? Org Spring Framework boot, and we have removed the Spring Boot starter dependency. So it's saying class not found. The reason you are not really getting a compilation error because we have a dependency on Spring Boot starter test, which we will remove at a later point in time, and this has a scope of test. So only when running the tests, Spring Boot starter test is available, and one of the transitive dependencies of Spring Boot starter test is Spring Boot starter. In a circular way, the Spring Boot application is still available, but it's not available when I run the Java application because it's only available in the scope of test. So when I run the unit test, I would have Spring Boot application available, but when I run the Java application like this, right click run as Java application, you would get a class not found exception. And that's cool. That's exactly what we would want because we don't want to make use of the Spring Boot functionality. How do I get rid of this error? The first thing I would need to do is to initialize a application context. As of now, what we are doing is we are using Spring Boot application as the annotation to initialize the application context. This is something which is provided by Spring Boot. We don't want to use that. The way you would define an application configuration in Spring is by using at configuration. So this is the Java way of doing this. We'll look at the XML way of doing that later. For now, let's restrict ourselves to the Java stuff. So at configuration, import it. So this is defining an at configuration. That's cool. So now I can remove the Spring Boot and application annotation. So this is at configuration, and the thing is this Spring Boot Spring application is also, if you look at it, is a org Spring Framework boot class. So if I run it right now, this program right now, let's see what would happen. Basic application, you would get a class not found on Spring application this time. So it's a Spring application not found again. So let's fix that as well. So let's not use this Spring application. The way you would usually create an application context is by using a class which is called annotation config application context. So AC type in control space annotation config application context. That's the one which I'm looking for. We need to create a new instance of this and pass in the application context class. That's the Spring Boot application.class. Okay, that's cool, isn't it? So now I'm creating an application context using annotation config application context, and I'm doing a little bit of stuff around it. Not a problem. Run as Java application. Another error. It says no such bean definition exception. So it's not able to find binary search IMPL. Why so? Because we have to define a component scan. So we have said at configuration, but we have not defined an at component scan yet. these are all the things Spring Boot does by default for us. Spring Boot automatically defines a component scan on the package where the configuration is present. But by default, Spring does not do that. So you have to do that. So add component scan. You can either do add component scan. This means component scan on the current package, or you can explicitly specify the package as well. Either of these ways should be fine. So either you can do this, or you can just leave add component scan in here, and let's see if we are finally successful. Let's run that. So it's now says class not found org slf for j logger factory. That's cool. That's not a problem at all, because this is slf for j which we need to add in. Let's add in a dependency on org slf for j. Just make the compiler happy. slf for j, and we want to use slf for j hyphen API. Let's wait for the compiler to build. May want to download the dependency and make it available for us. That's pretty cool. And now I can go ahead and run this again. Cool. Finally, we have the application running. So in this specific example that we have right now, we are not using Spring Boot at all. So all that we are doing is we are making use of basic Spring. The things which we have added in are at configuration. At configuration defines that this is a Spring configuration. In Java, if you want to define a Spring configuration, you use the bean at configuration. Component scan defines that this specific package needs to be scanned for components. The other thing which we have done is use annotation config application context to create the application context. And after that, the things remain as they are. The only things we have changed in the pom.xml are we removed the Spring starter and we added in Spring core, Spring context, and the slf for j API. That's all the changes that we had to do to get the whole thing working with Spring. One of the exercises I would love you to do is to migrate the other stuff. So whatever other things that you would see in here, the CDI application, the component scan application, and the scope application, it would be great if you can actually spend some time and try and play around with them and see if you can actually completely migrate them to use Spring instead of Spring Boot. When we talk about Spring Boot, you'd understand in depth about all the features that Spring Boot provides. But as students of In 28 Minutes, I would want you to have in-depth knowledge of what happens even without Spring Boot. And that's why we started doing this step, which is called Spring without Spring Boot. And in this step, we got our basic Java context working. And there are other things that you need to understand, including things like XML context, which we will approach in the next few steps. Until then, bye-bye.